Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar and I'm here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you have a question about The Hobbit, about Lord of the Rings, about the Silmarillion or any of his works, I'm the guy you can come to and I will answer as many questions as I can. If you want to submit a question, the proper way to do so is not in the comments, although you can, but if you want them to be in a video, just look in the description below and there is a link to my Quora account. You can go there to Quora, you can make an account pretty easily since you can just log in using Facebook or a Google account if you have one, and make a question about whatever it is that you want to ask me about, and then go ahead and tag me in it. I did link to my account directly. I'm pretty easy to find on there. So before we get to it though, I did promise you guys one thing that I would show off the books. Now I don't have every Tolkien book here because some of them are downstairs or out of the way or whatever, and really when it comes to research I don't really use these physical books all that much because I try to keep them in pretty good shape as many of them are very old. So I have PDF copies of all of Tolkien's work that I can quickly search through. But here is my ancient sort of, I guess you'd say, boxed set. I don't know. It's actually upside down. I put the books in there upside down, but it's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Yeah, no, here we go. So The Hobbit and all 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. And that's from, I believe, 1979, that printing. A lot of these are very old. This is the newest one. I just bought this a few months ago. This is a new copy of the Silmarillion. My old ratty paperback Silmarillion here, right? This is from 79. This is the illustrated, lovely hardcover. I mean, this is a really beautiful book. If you want to get a copy of the Silmarillion, it's got the elven writings on the side. It's got maps in there, illustrations by the author with color and everything. Really, really cool. I saw it on Amazon and I absolutely had to have it. I also have the Tolkien Reader here, which is a lot of his short fiction, a lot of the short stories, like, let's see, Tolkien's Magic Ring, The Homecoming of Bjornthelm's Son, Tree and Leaf, Farmer Giles of Ham, and The Adventures of Tom Bombadil are all in there. And finally, here's my Unfinished Tales. It's an old copy, too. Like I said, I don't tend to use these physical books. I read them, of course, but I don't tend to use them for research because I'd much prefer to use a PDF. No chance of me messing things up there, right? But anyway, let's get to your questions. So you guys submitted a lot of questions. I've picked my favorite ones to go over for this week's video, and like I said, you can stay anonymous or you can request it specifically, but here you go. So let's start with this one. We have a question here about Sam. Sam is one of my favorite characters from The Lord of the Rings. So this person asks, this is an anonymous one, where did the pan come from for Sam Gamgee to cook the rabbit in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers? So the cooking gear, right? Sam actually had that the whole time. It was since Hobbiton, he was carrying that around. He was carrying around a lot of things that you would think, whoa, Sam, you don't need to bring all that. But he felt it was all extremely necessary. Sam was sort of like the Boy Scout of the group, always be prepared, right? So Sam had all this cooking stuff. It was in his backpack. That's why he was always very weighed down. He was carrying a way heavier load than anybody else was. And it was mentioned that Sam is actually a really good cook, and not just in the way that all hobbits cook well, but even among hobbits, he was sort of like considered a really amazing cook. So this must have been a real treat for some of the members of the fellowship that weren't used to really, really good food being prepared all the time, because he actually did the majority of the cooking on the travels of the fellowship. So that's, it was just sort of in his character to always be prepared and always have this. He had the idea to cook a rabbit stew for Frodo. Gollum got the rabbits, Gollum got the water, and he tried to get Gollum to gather some herbs for him. They got into an argument about that. Gollum was not interested. He was offended that Sam was going to cook the rabbits. He thought that the meat should be eaten raw. And Sam promised him, like, if you do this one last thing for me, I promise I'll think of you better and I'll cook for you. And for Sam to offer to cook for you, that's a pretty great thing. But Gollum didn't appreciate it. This is where the meme came from, potatoes. Yes, that's actually in the book. It's not just from Peter Jackson's film. The potatoes thing is in there. So he offered to make fish and chips for Gollum if he did this, but figuring that was a nice thing to offer since Gollum had a fondness of fish, but Gollum did not like cooked meat, And he definitely was not interested in potatoes at all. He said, "Keep your nasty chips." So, good question. Okay, so here's one about Morgoth. This is a Silmarillion question that was also submitted anonymously. I don't know if there's an answer for this, but in the Silmarillion, it says Morgoth used a spear to destroy the two trees, but used Grond during his duel with Fingolfin. Why did Morgoth not keep using a spear? So there's a few reasons, but the main thing is what tool is best suited for the job. When Morgoth and Ungoliant came to destroy the two trees, he brought a spear, and he used it to pierce the trees. This itself did not actually destroy them, but it wounded them. He pierced them with his spear, and it said that the sap flowed out like blood. And then Ungoliant came, Ungoliant being an eldritch horror in the shape of a spider, and she sucked up all that sap, and she consumed the very blood of the two trees of Valinor as well as their light, and that's what actually killed them. Now, it's actually many, many years later when he dueled with Fingolfin. It was still, very early in Tolkien's history, but there was a lot of years between their centuries even. And you have to figure that Morgoth had been in his fortress for a while at this point. He's been in Middle-earth. It's a long time later. And he probably had all different types of weapons. But when it came to fight Fingolfin, he chose Grond, probably because it was to his liking. Grond, of course, was the hammer of the underworld in Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King during the Siege of Gondor, the host of the Witch King, which was, really the hosts of Sauron, but the Witch King was leading the armies of Mordor on the Siege of Gondor, and they smashed down the great door of Minas Tirith with a battering ram that they called Grond, and it was said to have been named after the Hammer of the Underworld of old. And the only mention of the actual Hammer of the Underworld was in the Silmarillion during the description of Fingolfin's duel with Morgoth. So I think it was partly that he just had to put Grond in there somewhere because it was mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. Remember that they were all sort of being written at the same time, right? And the Silmarillion was only published after the author's death. But really, it was just the right tool for the right job. So in the case of destroying the trees, he chose a spear. In the case of fighting Fingolfin, he chose a hammer. Okay, so next, this is another anonymous one. This person asks, what exactly is Gollum? So Gollum is essentially a hobbit. Gollum, whose original name was Smeagol, was one of the river people, and they were basically very early prototypical sort of hobbits. Gandalf described them as the fathers of the Stoors. So as a Stoor, Smeagol would have been taller than a Harfoot, though less tall than a Fallowhide, and he was stockier. He would have a broad frame, larger hands and feet. Stoors were the hobbits that most closely resembled men. Now remember, that doesn't mean that he was necessarily a Stoor, because this was way, way earlier. So what we know about the hobbits is they're basically an offshoot of the race of men. So the earliest of these people, the river people, were probably just very short men, halflings, which means half man. And they eventually became known as the Stoors, and then you had the other races, and they all intermarried and intermingled, and they became hobbits. So Smeagol was this guy. He was a local troublemaker. He was a ne'er-do-well. He wasn't really liked in his community. The only person that liked him was his grandmother, and I guess also Deagol, who was his friend. Some people say Deagol was his cousin, although that's not actually mentioned in the text. So Smeagol and Deagol were out fishing. Deagol fishes up the One Ring. He fishes up a fish, and he winds up in the river. He finds the One Ring. Smeagol murders him. Smeagol lives for hundreds of years in the dark and the dank. And the ring and his surroundings changed him. He eventually sort of underwent evolution of a sort. His skin became blackened. His eyes became large and bulging. His feet became webbed. Gollum became so far removed from what he was that you wouldn't look at him and say that he's a hobbit, and he wouldn't look at a hobbit and really recognize them as being something similar to himself. I don't think that Gollum remembered much about his past, but basically, essentially, he's a hobbit. He's just a very twisted one that had been through a great transformation from holding the ring for so long and from being away from the sun and away from fresh air. It really messed him up. Next, okay, so this question, oh boy. So this one was submitted by a Wild Watcher who asks, who wins, Eru Ilúvatar or all of fiction and all of nonfiction? So I think it's sort of impossible to really answer a question like this. How could you put Eru against all of fiction and expect it to be fair? All of fiction would include anything that the human imagination can come up with and put to word or to page or to a screen. So if you asked this question of J.R.R. Tolkien, he would probably have a knee-jerk reaction. He would say, of course, Eru is greater because Eru is God with a capital G. He created everything. None could be greater than God. And also, shut up. Now, I believe that he would really say that, too. However, when you're speaking of all of fiction, all one would have to do is create a character that by their very nature is greater than Eru. You just write about something greater than him. You can even call it Eru 2 if you were feeling really kind of cheeky about it. So what I'm getting at is the very question's faulty. All of fiction presupposes that there has to be some limit to that. Like, is it just published fiction, professionally published fiction, or are we including everything that anyone has ever imagined ever? Nonfiction, that's a little weird. You can't really do that. It's kind of meaningless because it's the mundane versus the divine, right? It's futile. So unless you're writing something about an absent god, an impotent god, or a toothless god, then it becomes fiction, though, you know? So going from Tolkien's stance and expanding it a little bit, I might say that any work of fiction was created by a child of Ilúvatar, and there is no music, which is really magic, that does not have its origin in Eru Ilúvatar. So any fictional character created by a child of Ilúvatar is derived from him, and any power used is his own power. This is kind of similar to what he said to Melkor at the beginning of the Silmarillion. There's nothing you can do that is going to mar the beauty of my creation. You're going to make it better in ways that you don't even understand, basically. So I hope that was satisfactory. I don't really think it's a fair question, though. So here's a question from, this is an anonymous one. Did Thorin Oakenshield have any children or a dwarvish wife? So Thorin was unmarried and he had no children. It's perhaps because Thorin was essentially exiled from his own rule for the majority of his life that he never had a wife. Maybe if he had lived, he would have taken a wife, even at his advanced age. He was 195 years old in The Hobbit. He was the oldest of Bilbo's companions, and generally speaking, the lifespan of a dwarf is about 250 years. So you have to figure 195, he's getting up there. But I think that had he lived and become king of the mountain for longer than a few days, he probably would have had a wife. He was succeeded by his second cousin, Dane II Ironfoot, and then his son was Thorin III Stonehelm, and that's where the line of Durin continued, but Thorin didn't have any sons or daughters. Okay, so here's a question submitted by EB Agent. So EB Agent asks, is it true that Gollum eats babies in the books? Well, this is something that Tolkien kind of leaves up to our imagination. He never wrote, by the way, this guy ate babies. He didn't describe it. He didn't go into visceral details, but it was heavily implied, and it was almost certainly true. Now, for this, while it wasn't proven, Gandalf believed that it was true, and I would say that's good enough for me. Now, we know that any infanticide and consuming of babies would have been after the Hobbit. Gollum was forced to leave his retreat under the mountains. He didn't have the One Ring anymore, so he was no longer safe in his retreat. He couldn't just hunt easily. He had to leave. So he had to contend with the sun. He called it the yellow face. He hated the sun. He was weak. He was starving. But he regrew his strength as he tracked Bilbo. Now, we know that he made it all the way to Dale, and then he heard news of Bilbo and where Bilbo's from, and he struck back west towards the Shire. though he wound up turning south and actually ended up in Mordor. Now, we know that Gollum had to have passed through Mirkwood twice, and it was there that the idea of him eating babies came from. So I'm going to read you a passage here. "Then why didn't he track Bilbo further?" asked Frodo. "Why didn't he come to the Shire?" "Ah," said Gandalf, "now we come to it. I think Gollum tried to. He set out and came back westward, as far as the great river, but then he turned aside. He was not daunted by the distance, I am sure. No, something else drew him away. So my friends think, those that hunted him for me. The wood elves tracked him first, an easy task for them, for his trail was still fresh then. Through Mirkwood and back again it led them, though they never caught him. The wood was full of the rumor of him, dreadful tales even among beasts and birds. The woodman said that there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. It climbed into trees to find nests. It crept into holes to find the young. It slipped through windows to find cradles. So it seems that he's hunting for food to regain his strength, and he crept into the dwellings of the woodsmen of Mirkwood looking for weak, defenseless babies to feed upon. Now, this may have been due to the fact that they were just easy prey. Or it could have been a belief that young meat is better for regaining strength, or just better in general. And I think that there might be something to that, because we see this when Gollum and Sam have their argument about the proper way to eat rabbits. I alluded to this earlier, and I'm going to read you another passage. "Stew the rabbits," squealed Gollum in dismay. "Spoiled beautiful meat, Smeagol, saved for you, poor hungry Smeagol. What for? What for, silly hobbit? They are young, they are tender, they are nice. Eat them, eat them." He clawed at the nearest rabbit, already skinned and lying by the fire. So Gollum's actually afraid of fire. He fears being burned, which is, understandable. Sauron burned him. And he feared that the fire may attract enemies, and he kind of had a point, because this is what wound up attracting Faramir and his men. And he prefers his meat raw, as I mentioned earlier. But he makes a point of saying that the rabbits that he hunted for Sam are young, tender, and nice. I kind of think he has a preference. And it was also mentioned, somebody in a comment on Quora mentioned this, that he also specifically liked to hunt young goblins. He didn't really like the taste of goblins, but when he did, he went after the young ones. So there really is showing that he had some sort of preference there, and it may have been a belief that by consuming something young, he would regain his strength. Okay, so this next question was asked by the Oski Boski. Is Saruman's ring bound to the One Ring? No, it was not a ring of power, but it was a lesser ring that was created without the proper ringcraft. So the rings of power were all bound to the One Ring, as they had all been created by the elves of Eregion under the direction and instruction of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He was actually Sauron in disguise. He taught the ringcraft to the elves, and they created the lesser rings, which were sort of practice attempts. But they were not rings of power. They were trinkets with small amounts of magic. Then they created 16 rings of power before Anatar left. Celebrimbor, who was the greatest elven smith of Eregion, later created 3 more, though he still used the same magic and knowledge that he obtained from Anatar. So these two were also bound to the One Ring once Sauron created it. However, Saruman's ring was a poor attempt. He did not have the knowledge or the magic to create a true ring of power. He could only make a pale imitation. There was never any mention of the lesser rings being bound to the One Ring, but even if they were, Saruman did not create his ring using the ringcraft of Anatar. He used his own attempt at enchantment. One last reason that Saruman's ring would not be bound to the One Ring is that Sauron didn't have the One Ring at the time. So that's why, for example, Elrond has his ring on him, Galadriel wears her ring, Gandalf wears his ring. They're all able to do that with no ill effects, because the One Ring was being held by Gollum or by Frodo, who did not really know how to tap into its power and control others. Okay. Next one is an anonymous one, and here we are. If no man can kill a Nazgul, could a wizard like Gandalf, Radagast, or Saruman kill a Nazgul in battle? Okay, so it's a bit of a misinterpretation of the prophecy on a few levels, actually. It was not said that no man could kill a Nazgul, but that it would not be by the hand of man that the Witch King would be killed or hindered. One specific Nazgul. And this was a prophecy told by Glorfindel. Now, there's sort of three ways that you can interpret this prophecy, at least three main ways. There's probably a whole lot more. The first, we could say man refers to gender, as it was in fact a woman who eventually did slay the Witch King. Now, this is, I think, a simplistic and possibly incorrect interpretation. Éowyn was not alone. She could not have done it alone. It certainly did give the Witch King pause when he stated first that no man can hinder him, and then she said, "You face a woman." Now, it occurred in that moment to him that he may have misunderstood the prophecy. This, I think, is very much on purpose. Prophecies in literature have always been something open to multiple interpretations. As a matter of fact, I remember hearing a story about Tolkien studying Shakespeare as a youth and being upset at the prophecy in Macbeth not being a more fantastical version. It was very mundane. So, the second way that we could look at it is that man refers to mortals. He could not be hindered by mortals. Now, I don't think this works either, because he was destroyed by two mortals, a human woman and a hobbit man. However unique this interpretation may be, it seems likely to me that this was the one that the Witch King believed, that he was unkillable by mortals. And when Éowyn said, "You face a woman," I think he thought in his mind, wait a minute, there's a different way of looking at this, and that's why he sort of faltered for a moment. Now, the third one that I'm going to talk about is that man is singular, a single mortal. And this is actually the interpretation that I personally prefer. No single mortal person can kill him, but by working together, two can. This is also exactly what happened. Éowyn would have failed alone. The stab that she did, that would have killed her, not him. It would have consumed her. Her arm would have probably exploded. She would have died. If Merry had stabbed the Witch King, it would have hurt him, of course, because that blade was special. It was made a long time ago by men of Westernessa, and it had special enchantments on it, and this is what made the Witch King actually vulnerable for the first time ever. But it wasn't the killing blow. Éowyn gave the killing blow. It needed to be the both of them. If Éowyn was alone, she would have died. If Merry was alone, he would have died. This is a common theme in Tolkien's work, especially The Lord of the Rings, that the races and the different peoples have to come together to topple evil because they can't do it alone. They can't do it apart. Now, by no stretch of the imagination do the wizards count as men. They may count as male, in as such as their bodies match the gender that Eru determined that their spirits have. Because the Ainur, those are basically angels, they chose forms based on their feelings. They looked upon Eru's creation and they changed their shape and hue, and part of it was making gendered bodies to match what they felt inside of them. And these were the thoughts that were given to them by Eru Ilúvatar. So, basically what I'm getting at is the wizards are not men. They are male in a specific way, but they are not men. So I do not believe that the Witch King could only be destroyed by a woman, but that he could only be destroyed by the bonds that people create. Éowyn could have fled before him. That's what he was looking for. He was looking for her to run. And so many others already had, but Theoden lay there wounded and dying, and she wanted to get between them. And it was the bond that she had with her uncle that gave her the courage to stand up to the Witch King. And there was a bond also between Merry and Éowyn. Even though he knew her as a different person, he thought that she was some soldier. He didn't realize that she was a woman, that it was Éowyn in disguise. But they had been traveling together, and they had grown rather close. and their bond is what spurred Merry to attack. So in a lot of ways, Éowyn and Merry, a shield maiden and a halfling that doesn't have great battle experience, besting Sauron's top guy, this is sort of like the Last Alliance. Sauron was toppled by two kings, Elendil and Gil-galad, and that went pretty. They died, but they did win. So it wasn't because they were so great. It was because they had a bond. It was because they were working together. There's a reason that battle was called the Battle of the Last Alliance and not something like the downfall of Sauron. But, the wizards, could they defeat the Nazgul? Yeah, probably. They're angels. The Nazgul, they may be powerful sorcerers, but they are men. They are of mortal doom. So the prophecy doesn't really, apply to them just because they're dudes, is basically what I'm getting at. Okay. So let's see. This is another anonymous one. By what measure does the time in Lord of the Rings go? Okay, so this is actually, I think this is a good question, and the answer is that it varied, and it was a little bit complex at first, but eventually it settled into a familiar calendar and a time system that we all know. So initially, the planet Arda was a flat disk, and there was ambient light that was the misty miasma around the ground. I mean, it was devoid of life. So the Valar gathered up all the light, and they put it into two great lamps. One was in the north and another in the south, and these were the main light source for Arda. There was no day or night. There was just this constant light, and it was called the Spring of Arda. So after the lamps were destroyed by Melkor, the next light source for the planet was the two trees of Valinor, one of which was gold, and the other was silver. Now, the trees were eventually also destroyed by Melkor, but the daughter of the golden tree became the sun, and the son of the silver tree became the moon. So the Maiar Arian took the sun, and Tilion took the moon, and they bore them into the sky. This is where the concept of night and day comes from, and the concept of solar years. Now, before this, in the time of the trees, the years were counted directly by the Valar. We called them Valian years. One Valian year is like 9.5 solar years. So the Spring of Arda, which was 1,600 Valian years, was about 15,300 and somewhat solar years. So the sun was also bore across the sky initially at a greater speed, and Arian would reach the horizon and then turn around and go back. So then she was asked by the Valar to slow down and to encircle the planet instead of just going back and forth, so that there was a day and a night. And this was really a big help for the elves, because the elves love the night sky. They love the stars. So from the First Age onwards, once the sun settled into her normal routine, time became consistent with what we know. There was 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 52 weeks in a year, 12 months in a year. And they even have a lot of the same names for months that we currently use. Different cultures count years differently, and of course there's different languages. There's things like Shire reckoning, but it's understood what time and year it is just by, anybody would know. Once the Akalabeth happened in the Second Age, Arda became a round sphere instead of a flat disk, and this would likely introduce something like time zones to the planet, but this was never mentioned because all of the relevant stories take place in Northwest Middle-earth and in Endor, so to speak. So there's never a great difference in time in the travels of the primary characters. Okay, here's an interesting question. This was submitted by Bruce. Bruce asks, why did they add so much additional material to the live-action version of The Hobbit rather than just stick to the story from the book? So there's two big things that happen here. Guillermo del Toro and executive meddling, and that's what messed it all up. So Guillermo del Toro was the original director of The Hobbit, and he's actually usually one of my favorite directors. I really like his movies. I was excited to see his version of The Hobbit at the time. But he didn't seem to actually understand the book, and he made a lot of alterations before he left the project, many of which were kept because they didn't have a lot of time to change things. Peter Jackson was sort of brought in last minute. Del Toro decided to do 2 movies instead of 1, and his additions were, like I said, not great choices. So the studio basically begged Peter Jackson to return, and he didn't really have much interest in it, but he did it anyway. And shortly after this, he did announce that the studio wished for another trilogy. The Lord of the Rings had done well, and people like trilogies, so they wanted another trilogy. So Peter Jackson has a little bit of experience in stretching one book into three because, for example, The Two Towers, the book, the end of the Fellowship of the Ring movie, the last few scenes, that's actually part of The Two Towers, and then the events of The Two Towers play out in Return of the King until about halfway through the film. Now, some of that was his insistence on doing everything chronologically, but it really shows out how one book can be stretched out like that. Now, here's the thing, though. This is uncharted territory. He had to put enough material into these films to make three. Part of this was material inspired by Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, but he didn't actually have the rights to this. Nobody has the rights to make a movie out of this. It's never been sold. So they could do the events of it that were mentioned in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Lord of the Rings appendices, but they can't actually do the more detailed versions that you would see in, say, The Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales. Unfinished Tales actually gives you a lot of detail to what Gandalf was up to during The Hobbit and slightly before The Hobbit, but they can't adapt that. They're legally not allowed to, so they had to create something new. So basically what I'm getting at is the original director jumped ship and he left behind mostly ideas that weren't really suitable to the project. The studio insisted on a trilogy, and the director was not all that interested in it, so he kept the previous ideas and he added a lot of filler to make the trilogy, which is why The Hobbit turned out the way it did. Okay, so here's a question. This is an anonymous one, and if Gandalf was a Maya of wisdom, why did he have trouble figuring out the riddle at the mines of Moria? I like this question, and it's actually because he thought there was even a riddle at all. Gandalf was, he had been through Moria once before, but he was going in the other direction, so he never had to contend with a specific door. And the translation, he took it as speak, friend, and enter. It was actually say, friend, and enter. They're the same word with different inflections, but written down, you can't really tell that. So he thought that there was some sort of spell or incantation or password that he would have to say. This is an example of the smartest guy in the room overthinking what's actually quite simple. He did not consider that it was simple. He had been used to the way that things are and forgotten how they were, and how, though Moria was a dwarven dwelling, the door was wrought by the elves, and often it was actually stood open, and the only thing stopping anyone from walking in was friendly dwarven door wardens who would welcome in the elves. So the real question actually becomes, why didn't Legolas say anything? Legolas knows the language. He might have said, hey, maybe it's just say friend. Maybe Legolas wasn't paying attention. He was actually barely a character at this point. He had only been introduced a little while ago. He had barely said two words at all in the Fellowship of the Ring up to this point. So it's possible that he was just looking out for danger, or he was just letting Gandalf do his thing. Gandalf's the smart guy. He's going to figure it out. And eventually Gandalf did figure it out. I know in the movie it was Frodo that kind of came up with the idea, but in the book, Gandalf eventually got the door opened, and when they asked him about it, he said, I was overthinking it. It was very simple, and I've forgotten that those were happier times. Okay, next question. Why did Manwe call upon Eru to destroy Numenor when Ulmo himself would have been quite capable of doing it? So it wasn't about who was capable, but who had the authority. There was a big hard and fast rule for the Valar to not raise arms against the children of Ilúvatar. In the case where men of Numenor raised arms against them, they certainly had the ability to retaliate, but not necessarily the authority. Only Eru could do such a thing, because it wasn't about just Pharazôn's fleet. Eru wiped Numenor off the map. The good, the bad, the young, the old, the guilty, the innocent, they all died. The only person on the whole island that didn't die was Sauron. So this plays into what Gandalf said to Frodo in the early part of Lord of the Rings about the taking of life, because he was telling the story about Bilbo and Gollum. And Frodo said, it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance. And Gandalf spoke about pity and the taking of life and the giving of life. He said, there are a lot of people who live that deserve death, and there are a lot of people that die that deserve life. Can you give it to them? You may have the ability to give a living person death, but do you have the ability to give a dead person life? Only Eru could do that. Only Eru has the authority to wipe a nation out like that, wholesale. So, that kind of decision only could come from Eru. The fact that Ulmo could do it doesn't mean that he really had the authority to do it. Okay. This question is another anonymous one. Could the Hobbits have established their own country? Well, they did. That's what the Shire is. The Shire is their country. The Shire was founded by Hobbits who came from Bree. They discovered the land and they got the permission from the King of Arnor at the time to settle there. It grew a lot throughout the Third Age. Hobbits from all over the north came to live there, and as the other races generally did not live there, the Shire pretty much became the Hobbits' country. In the Fourth Age, Aragorn actually declared it a free zone to be governed by Hobbits, and there was also a ban on men. Men were not allowed to travel to the Shire without permission. Now, the Hobbits had already been governing themselves for a long time, but that's because there was an absence of a king. Now that there was a king, he was pretty much saying, I'm not going to interfere. You guys know what you're doing. You've been doing a bang-up job. You do it yourself, right? He also did make the Shire bigger. The land of Westmarch was added to the Shire, as well as Buckland. Buckland was Shire adjacent. It wasn't technically within the boundaries of the Shire, but after Aragorn's decree, it did officially become part of the Shire. Okay, so let's see. We have, who submitted this one? This is from Edward. Edward asks me, what would have happened if a Nazgul found Frodo and put on the ring? So I'm understanding that you mean, what if the Nazgul put the One Ring on himself? I don't know that they would do that, right? The Nazgul wouldn't defy Sauron's order. Sauron told them, bring back the ring and any who hold the ring. And I don't believe that they're actually able to defy Sauron because they're permanently bound to him. But let's indulge the hypothetical for a moment and imagine Sauron neglected to tell them not to do this, or for some reason they misunderstood his order and wore the ring. So I don't think there'd be any physical difference. They are already invisible, save the cloaks that they adorn to give themselves shape. Now, I do think that if a Nazgul put on the One Ring, they would at least appear to disappear, to vanish, because the cloaks and weapons that they have would disappear. And the reason for my assumption is thus. When Frodo puts on the One Ring, he is able to see the Nazgul as they are in the Wraith world, and he sees them as pale, ghostly figures adorned as kings. That is to say that he sees them wearing the clothing that they wore when they first became Wraiths. So when Frodo puts on the ring and he's drawn into the Wraith world, his clothes go with him, his adornments go with him, and this is the same for Bilbo or Gollum or anybody else who wore the ring. Anything that you're wearing or holding or have on you goes with you. So, with this mechanic in place, I can assume that whatever adornments the Nazgul had on them when they first became Wraiths are fully in the Wraith world, but the garments, such as cloaks, that they used to give themselves shape would be drawn into the Wraith world with them if they put on the One Ring. So, as for the mental or spiritual effects, I mean, it's not like they could be corrupted. They are already as corrupt as it gets. Though it begs the question, would a Nazgul that wore the One Ring be able to bring himself to give it up to Sauron? Is the compulsion to keep the ring stronger than their bond to Sauron? I would hazard a guess that it's not the case, and I think in the presence of Sauron, the ring would just jump ship anyway. It would fly off their fingers, and then Sauron would get it, and probably not be too happy with whatever Nazgul actually wore his ring. Final question, and this one came from Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, is there a linguistic reason that all the great northern and southern rivers in Arda end with the same N sound? And the examples she gives, Syrian, Kellyan, or Gellian, I'm sorry. I was confusing Gellian and Kelduin. There's two different rivers there. So Syrian, Gellian, Kelduin. Esgalduin, Baranduin, Bruinen, and Anduin. So anytime that Tolkien names something, there's always a linguistic reason. And this comes from the words in Sindarin. So the word Duin means large river. So from this we can derive Anduin is long river, Esgalduin is river under the shade, Baranduin is golden brown river, and Kelduin is the running river. Sir is river as well. It's not great river, it's just river by itself. So that's where you get Sirion, which is great river. And Ion just means large or roomy. Gelion, this is a mysterious one. So it's not actually Sindarin, it's not glossed properly, but it might be the Ilkhurin language where Gelion means bright, but it could also mean merry singer. It could be something like a babbling brook or something like that, and it could be bright. They both could be true. And finally, Bruinen translates to something like noisy water, and it is referred to as the loud water. So there you go. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you guys next week with more questions. Send me all the questions you can. Tag me on Quora, and I will pick my favorite ones to include in the next video. Goodbye.